If you and I had been standing on this spot in the Oklahoma Panhandle on certain days during the 1930s, we wouldn't be able to see this house. In fact, we might have had a hard time seeing our own hands. We'd have been in the midst of a black blizzard, a storm of earth and wind. This was the Dust Bowl, and the people who lived here will never forget it.
When those storms hit, you could see them rolling in here. Maybe it would last for 10 minutes, maybe it'd last for 30 minutes. You could put your hand in front of your eyes and you couldn't count the fingers on your hand.
It was the blackest black you ever saw.
Several times during those storms, when they first hit, it was total darkness, even though the sun was still up.
It would come into every crack. We would tape all of the windows. We'd tape all of the doors that were not in use. We would try to just tape everything out, and yet there was always a film of dirt in the air, dust.
It was a frightening thing because you thought, well, we might even not survive this thing because we didn't know what was behind it. People thought the world was come to an end.
What happened in the 1930s to cause this terrible calamity? Hi, I'm Ellen Gilberti. Why did this rich, fertile soil, which had been producing bumper crops of wheat and corn, take to the air in huge clouds of choking dust? What part did the natural environment have in this tragedy? What part did people play in causing it? The Dust Bowl of the 1930s had no exact boundaries. The worst affected area was this 5-state region of northern Texas, northeastern New Mexico, southeastern Colorado, southwestern Kansas, and the Oklahoma Panhandle. But at one time or another during the 30s, areas of blowing soil could be found all over the Great Plains, extending north well into the Canadian prairie provinces. It's the climate of the Great Plains which causes dust storms. Hot summers with little rain. Normal precipitation is usually less than 20 inches for the entire year, and that's in good times. There are periods of major drought when it hardly rains at all. It's a natural process that's been going on for thousands of years. For centuries, the Cheyenne, Pawnee, and Sioux tribes lived off this land, hunting buffalo and gathering seeds and roots. The Spanish came to the southern plains in the 1500s. They found wide open ranges covered with hardy prairie grass, perfect for raising cattle. Spanish vaqueros were our first cowboys. Then in the 1870s, the railroad opened up the plains to homesteaders from the east. Farmers now settled here and planted wheat, oats, and corn. But at the beginning of this century, most of this vast area was still untouched by the plow. It was only after 1910 that large-scale farming began in earnest. Power machinery made it possible. The Great Plains lent itself to the new tractors and harvesters. One farmer could now work a huge area. From 1910 through the 1920s, the amount of land under cultivation increased dramatically. With their profits, the farmers plowed more land and bought still more equipment.
Back in 1927, I had a little farm and I called that heaven. Well, the price is up and the rain come down and I hauled my crops all into town. I got the money, bought clothes and groceries, fed the kids and raised the family. Rain quit.
I guess the 20s were pretty good. In 1926, this county, it is a pretty large county, it's Texas County, was the Banner County, United States. It produced more wheat than any county in the United States. 20s were just bumper crop. For about 7 years in a row, we just had bumper crop after bumper crop. I guess it turned around and spoiled us a little bit too.
Farmers like Mr. Grounds used a technique called dry farming, which depends on ground moisture, water which is naturally stored in the soil. Some fields were left unplanted each year, so the precipitation would replenish the moisture in the soil. Dry farming worked well here for a time because there was plenty of rain and snow. But in this area, a wet period is always followed by a dry period. Farmers didn't realize it back then, but their farming methods, so successful in the 20s, would soon bring on disaster. In the 30s, drought returned to the plains. The soil moisture essential to dry farming was not replenished, and these fields became highly vulnerable to erosion. The hot summer sun beat down. The fragile soil became drier and drier. Crops died off. The grass withered. Millions of acres had no vegetation to protect them from the constant winds.
The Great Depression started in New York, of course, in 1929 with the crash of Wall Street. That didn't affect us here until 1931 when our crop prices dropped to nothing. Actually, we had good prosperity in 29 and 30, but 31 crop prices got down to where wheat was as low as 17 cents a bushel. So we not only had the drought and the Dust Bowl, we had the Great Depression at the same time.
Unable to grow a crop, unable to pay off their debts, they were forced to abandon their farms by the thousands. Huge areas of land, stripped of all vegetation and plowed smooth, were left exposed to the elements. And then they started.
On the 14th day of April of 1935, there struck the worst of dust storms that ever filled the sky. From Oklahoma City.
And that day of that Black Sunday, you couldn't tell the color of the blanket on your bed. And just about dusk, this black cloud started coming in from the northwest, and it got as calm as death. And the kids was out in an old tree row playing, and we screamed for them to come to the house. And before they got there, we couldn't tell which child was which child. I can remember being worried when the kids would go off to school of a morning, wondering if they'd get back, you know. And of course, it was always the problem of cleaning.
Mother turned the plates upside down on the table while they were preparing meals so that dust wouldn't get on the plates. Then when we put the food on the table, well, everybody would turn their plates right side up and start eating and get a little dust with it, but at least we'd kept it off of the plates while the food was being prepared and put on the table.
It'd be just like midnight. You couldn't even see the front of your car, the radiator ornament. That's how thick it was. But I found out that I could stick my head out the window and look straight down, and I could see the bar ditch. And by doing so, I could reach back to my steering wheel and creep along the road.
You couldn't even see, you could do like this, and you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. At night when we would go to bed, we would hang wet sheets out. And yet of a morning when we wakened, there would be the little white spot on the pillow where our heads were, and the rest was all dust.
In the mid-1930s, dust storms became regular occurrences. Farm families were suffering terribly. This was a time before government programs like welfare or public assistance. There was a very real danger of widespread hunger, homelessness, and even starvation. Charities and local governments were overwhelmed. In desperation, normally self-reliant farmers looked to the only organization which could cope with a disaster on this scale, the federal government in Washington. The first problem was to convince the American public that there really was a problem. In an age before the instant communications of television, this movie, produced in the 30s, dramatized for all to see the terrible human suffering caused by the Dust Bowl.
Baked out, blown out, and broke. Year in, year out, uncomplaining, they fought the worst drought in history. Their stock choked to death on the barren land. Many went ahead of them, but many stayed until stock, machinery, homes, credit, food, and even hope were gone. Blown out, baked out, and broke. Nothing to stay for, nothing to hope for. Homeless, penniless, and bewildered, they joined the great army of the highway. 50,000 a month. The sun and winds wrote the most tragic chapter in American agriculture.
In all, 500,000 people were forced off the Great Plains. Many headed for the rich farmland of California and the state of Washington, refugees in their own country.
Some of them did real well. Others got out there, they could find jobs and work. But in the case of my parents, everything that my parents owned was on that farm. And they took a trip and was going to find a new place to locate just to get out of the dust. But after they had looked the situation over and what it would cost to move somewhere else, they decided to stick it out. They just thought that someday the winds would stop, the dust would quit, and the rains would come, and things would get better.
I was in the car business, and customers would come in every day and looking for a cheap pickup or a car, just anything to get out of here.
The federal government in Washington, D.C. took action. Under the administration of President Franklin Roosevelt, the government had already begun to combat a growing economic depression with a collection of government programs called the New Deal. For Dust Bowl farmers who remained on the land, the New Deal meant immediate relief: feed for livestock, money to buy fuel, food and clothing for their families. Government subsidies made it possible for many to stay on their farms. More than that, it gave them hope.
That old dry spell killed my crop, boys, but it can't kill me, Lord, and it can't kill me. That old dust might kill my wheat, boys, but it can't kill me, Lord, and it can't kill me.
The government turned its attention to the Dust Bowl itself and the unprotected, vulnerable soil that was the raw material for the dust storms. Could anything be done? Some people feared that the entire Great Plains from Canada to Texas would become one vast desert. From the back of a railroad car, President Roosevelt visited farmers. He urged them to stay and fight. It was 1935, and the federal government had declared war on the Dust Bowl.
It relates to working out a plan of cooperation with nature instead of going along with what we've been doing in the past, trying to buck nature.
Cooperating with nature meant stabilizing the land, somehow holding down close to 100 million acres of drifting soil. It would be a massive job. Roosevelt's New Deal provided money for many government agencies to work on the problem. The Soil Conservation Service, known by its initials, SCS, was one of the most important. Their first job was to survey the Dust Bowl region. The SCS began by taking aerial photographs of every county in the Dust Bowl. How much land had been eroded? How much of the soil was heavy clay? How much was light and sandy? Different types of soil needed different care. These color-coded maps provided planners with the information they needed. Now the fight to control the dust storms could begin in earnest. It was a war fought on many fronts, starting with education. Teaching farmers methods of agriculture more in tune with the climate and delicate soil of the Great Plains. The Soil Conservation Service set up experimental farms and teams of county agents to work with farmers and ranchers. Other government agencies provided funding to put these new techniques into practice. In this land of uncertain rain, holding the precious water in the ground was a major concern. On flat land, farmers were taught a technique called listing, plowing shallow trenches which would trap the rain. If their land was hilly, farmers were taught terracing. They plowed ridges of earth along the contour of the hills. Now, instead of the rain running straight off, it would be forced to flow along the terraces until it was absorbed into the soil. New Deal agencies attacked the Dust Bowl on other fronts. The Forest Service planted millions of trees in a massive government program called the Shelter Belt Program. The trees would break the force of the wind. The tough prairie grass, once intentionally burned or overgrazed, was now seen to be a valuable resource. Large areas were declared national grasslands and taken out of cultivation. The government organized planting of special drought-resistant grass whose roots would anchor the drifting soil and protect it from the powerful wind. These and dozens of other government programs were an attempt to undo some of the damage caused in part by poor farming methods, to break the cycle of soil erosion that was one of the causes of the Dust Bowl.
Always after a disaster, then there's something nice happens, you know. And then the rains came and we planted crops.
1939 was the turning point. Farmers who had stuck it out through the long, dry, terrible 30s once again began to prosper.
It kind of seemed like a dream. When we raised our first decent crop, we raised a little in 1938, 39, we raised a pretty decent crop. We just couldn't believe it. And then 40, we had another one, and 41, a fair one, and 42 was just like the 20s were, just bumper crop. For about 7 years in a row, we just had bumper crop after bumper crop.
Appropriate technology and attention to protection of the soil could help control the dust storms, but nothing could change the climate. In the 1950s and again in the 1970s, this region was hit by drought, and the drought brought more dust storms. But these dust storms were not nearly as bad as those of the 30s. We can't do anything about the climate. There will always be dry periods and more dust storms in these parts. It's inevitable. But we can make things worse, or we can help to make things better. How should we relate to our natural environment? What lessons do we learn from the experience of the farmers before, during, and after the Dust Bowl era?
And the whole sky was just black. And I took my little boy by the hand and rushed to the house, but before I could get up the steps, I couldn't see him. I had remembered where a chair was sitting in the kitchen. I found it, sat down, and took my little boy on my lap. I couldn't see him, and I held him tight because I was afraid that he would get afraid and start crying or something. And every little bit, he'd reach up and touch my cheek.